What we're going to share with you in this next panel is a lot of the gist of the discussions that we've had this last day and a half. And it's a really inspiring group of people who've shared a lot of information. So we'll summarize some of that and then have a discussion and then open it up to questions from you all. So we're really happy to have this group here, and we'll get started right away. So this is Sofia Aroca. So she's here, you'll find her, she's famous. She's one of the incredible leaders working in countries around the world. Sofia's from Chile, who just think about these leaders, they're trying to help us work differently. So they're trying to help us think about how do I harness across government ministries and across communities in her country to incorporate this kind of information in policy and finance. And Sofia is working, she's instrumental in Chile's Natural Capital Committee, which is a really innovative new initiative from the government, which is cross-ministerial. So talking about working differently, it's based in it's chaired by the Environment Ministry, but it also includes the Finance Ministry where Sofia sits and many other ministries that you can see listed here, including Chile's central bank. And this new way of working across these sectors and across these ministries is designing a new way to incorporate nature's benefits into a whole host of government policies and also driving a lot of excitement about new finance. So Sofia and her work in her committee is an example of the kind of work that we're going to share with you, that we've been doing with 15 countries around the world and that we're expanding to more. So if you find Sofia, you can ask her about it. So the panel today is this group of us, as I said, sharing what we've been discussing with the countries in the last day and a half. So I'll give a little overview, and then we'll hear from several of our Multilateral Development Bank colleagues listed here. And then we'll close with reflections from Adam Wang-Levine from the US Treasury, who plays a really interesting role in supporting these international finance institutions and implementing these approaches. Okay, so what we've been doing in this community, and some of you have been helping us do this for almost 20 years now, is incredible work trying to help spark the innovation and help support what countries are doing around the world. You can see some of the many places and geographies and decision contexts we've been working in, each of these different colors. Lately, we've been really turning our sights towards saying, how can we move beyond dots on a map? How can we move beyond supporting the work in individual countries and try to accelerate this pace? Because the demand, as we've all hoped, is exploding. So what we've started about a year and a half ago is this effort to work in 15 countries in 15 months. So very accelerated effort to accelerate the pace at which natural capital approaches are implemented in policy decisions and finance decisions. So this is really the spirit of getting started in these 15 countries and then helping them design a long-term strategy for keeping that work going. And I think our new tagline is exhibited at the bottom, which is supporting countries who are the innovators. They're the ones thinking about how does natural capital, the value of biodiversity, affect my policy and my finance goals for my country, my human development goals. And then the multilateral development banks such as ADB, IDB, and the World Bank are the scalers. They're the implementers, and they can systematize a lot of this work. So this little diagram here just showcases kind of where we are in this moment. So the bottom panel is a reflection of decades of work developing scientific methods for mapping and valuing the biodiversity and the ecosystem benefits that flow to people on the planet. There's a lot of new work that needs to be done. We're doing it, you'll hear it this week, mental health in cities, et cetera. But there's a huge body of new approaches and science that we can build on that is now ready to be deployed. And the middle panel of this infographic is where all the hard work is. And our friends in Sweden helped us coin this term, the 80-20 rule. So there's about 80% of the really hard work that we're doing right now is engaging decision makers, engaging people in communities, in governments, in development banks, in private finance, to really understand what drives their decisions from the household level to a finance institution, what drives their decisions and what metrics of ecosystem value. It can be monetary, it can be tons of carbon, it can be in terms of temperature, degrees C. It can be in terms of number of people or the type of people who live in different places. Many different currencies of value will inform the decisions. And then what we're seeing is an incredible explosion of policy innovation and finance instruments once we have this basic ability to do an assessment, map and model, and quantify nature's benefits and decisions. And that's what we'll hear a little bit more about from my MDB colleagues here. And these little side panels that are added here just really showcase what are the elements of working differently? What are Sophia and other leaders in countries really doing? And part of it is developing capacity, part of it is technical, and part of it is mapping to policy. So what we've talked about over the last 2 days and what we've been working on with these 15 countries and 3 development banks over the last year are 3 distinct pathways to impact. And these are each new ways of working. So one is technical, and that's doing natural capital assessments and natural capital accounting depending on what the government and the communities in each place need. What kind of information about nature's value do they need to help them open a policy window or drive greater finance? So those are new pathways that we're helping forge together. The other one is to map that information into specific policy windows that's coming up for their governments, or a specific investment window like a bond or a loan or lots of different ways to get finance. So we really try to meet the governments and the multilateral development banks where the current opportunity is so we can get these processes jump-started. And then finally, this crucial pathway we're opening up is in developing capacity. So as we talked about earlier, some of you were in here, there's a growth in finance now for this biodiversity and climate nexus, and our MDB colleagues will talk about that in just a minute. But there's a real dearth of capacity for technical work and mapping technical to policy innovation that we really need to generate together. So this is where we want your help. And I'm not going to go into all the details here, but over the next week, you will hear these terms. You will hear natural capital assessments. You'll hear natural capital accounting. You'll hear UNCIA. These are different approaches that incorporate nature's values into quantified, sometimes mapped, sometimes not, products that can then drive what we all want in the middle there, which is change in policy and change in finance. And then on the far right, of course, is what we are all striving for. That's our shared goal, which is to live better lives, be safer, be more fulfilled, and have a stewardship mindset in creating that. So this conceptual model is what is the basis for all the work you'll hear about. So I'll just say here, there's a lot of technical capacity that's been developed and some really exciting new elements of how to do that capacity development that you'll hear about this week. I'm not going to go into detail here, but I'll make a plug for this session on Friday that Biosphere Intelligence is hosting for us. So finally, I'm just going to close here by saying that this will take an incredible effort of all of us in this room, and there's amazing power in this diverse network that we have. And so if you hear ways that you can help or ways that you want to ask for help, the experts are in the room. So just mingle and talk with one another. And I feel really hopeful after this last couple of check-ins, and I hope you will too after this panel, that we're on a good track and the right people are in the room to really accelerate this progress. So thanks for listening, and I'll turn next to Greg Watson from IDB.
Thanks, Mary, and hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to see so many people. It's growing and growing from year to year. I'm from the Inter-American Development Bank. It's the development bank, the regional development bank that works with Latin America and the Caribbean. And you might ask, like, why does a development bank care about this? And why do I have a job, right? And part of that is because what we've done at the IDB since 2018 is really focus on the values that nature brings to people, the cultural values, the economic values. We live in a region where there's tremendous natural assets and biodiversity, and there's tremendous importance to indigenous communities, Afro-descendant communities, and other populations. And so we use statistics like the ones you see on the screen that I'm not going to read out, but I mean the same statistic that was seen before in the keynote about half of global GDP being based on nature. In our region, there's huge numbers, 64 million jobs in Latin America and the Caribbean. 19% of the employment in the region depends on natural resources. And so when we start to look at this, we discuss this with our countries, we look at what happened in Montreal with the CBD, our management actually started to, in our institutional strategy, integrate this, which I think is really important because that's the macro level document for how the bank is going to work. And so we've put nature at the core of our institutional strategy, which was just recently approved and published. We specifically talk about transitioning from carbon neutrality to nature positivity in the region and supporting countries on those journeys. The region really being a nature powerhouse and a solution provider to the rest of the world in terms of examples of how to better integrate biodiversity values into public and private decision making. And then some of the actions that you see in the last part of the slide are what we're here to talk about, right? Integrating biodiversity values into fiscal planning, into policies, regulations, policy coherence, which means can we lower the $800 billion per year biodiversity finance need by actually reducing the need for some of that funding? Because if we're damaging over here, we have to pay over here to restore, and they say that that's about 500 billion of that 800 billion. And how do we strengthen capacities in the countries? So that's at the macro level of our institutional strategy. But then at the IDB, we just have recently approved our action plan, which is like, how are we going to do this? And what are the indicators? And how do we better integrate this into our policy internally, into our planning internally, and how do we support the countries? And so we've done that now. It's, again, aiming to support the countries. The action plan itself is focused on 4 pillars. We dialogue with countries, we ask countries what they need, and sometimes I say I feel like a car salesman because part of my discussion is like, what can nature do for you based on your priorities? And then showing how those values can link into the policy decisions. Internally at the bank, we mainstream with our different departments and sectors, and then we do a lot of knowledge generation with partners like NatCap, and then we mobilize resources from the international community for this work. So it's not just domestic resources, it's international resources, and it's private resources. And all of this is in line with something that in 2021 MDBs did jointly. The IDB helped to lead the MDBs in a joint statement on nature, people, and planet. And people is the second word there. And that basically has 5 pillars that show how MDBs together are going to lead, do nature positive investment, do regional synergies, and really help to meet the needs and what eventually became the different components of the Montreal Convening Framework. At the IDB, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on this. There's a session tomorrow that I urge you all to come to on results-based finance where we'll talk in detail. But we've put together results-based finance mechanisms internally. We've really upped our commitments to this kind of funding. And we've also worked a lot on different financial mechanisms. And so we've supported debt for nature conversions in Ecuador and in Barbados. We were the first MDB to actually support these kinds of transactions, which so far have generated about $600 million for conservation through conservation trust funds in those two countries. We work a lot on biodiversity credits, on different kinds of bonds, on early stage investment, nature as an asset class, but also linking to conditional cash transfers, so that if we're looking at poverty alleviation and previously had been done around education, linking those conditional cash transfers for indigenous and local communities that are actually the stewards of the resources. We mobilize a lot of resources from donors and from the international arena. So just in our program, we've worked with France on forests. We've worked with the UK on blue carbon and mangroves. We worked with the Green Climate Fund in the Amazon. And then with Canada, we're working on upstreaming all of these concepts into the nature-based solutions of infrastructure and AFOLU sectors. And then the US, we've actually just recently approved a fund for the America's Partnership countries looking at financial mechanisms for biodiversity and climate. And we obviously work with the GEF quite a bit, including on this program. We're doing these rapid natural capital assessments with Stanford, with NatCap, and with Ecuador, with Uruguay, with Colombia, with Chile, and with Belize, and all of them have their own flavor. It's really interesting. Some of them are around KPIs, some of them are around developing financial instruments, some of them are around satellite accounts and natural capital valuations for policy decisions. And I think the diversity is what really makes it exciting, because we're seeing what works in what contexts. And this is a little bit of an example of some of the projects that we're doing, and there's amazing professionals here from these countries that I urge you to talk to. And I think what's most exciting is that we're not just talking to ministries of environment. Actually, what our governors, our shareholders, are ministries of finance. So we're able to go to them and make these cases using the economic data that we work on with NatCap and explain why this is important for a ministry of finance. And so you have people from ministries of planning and ministries of finance here, along with their environment colleagues, really creating that cross-sectoral work. We do a lot of knowledge. I'm not going to talk too much about that. You can go to the IDB webpage and see some of the knowledge. But jointly as MDBs, we've also worked on a tracking methodology to track what is nature positive investment and what's nature investment, and how can we show that at the end of the year. And that's actually, we're piloting that this year. We also, our president recently announced working with other MDBs on KPIs and impact indicators around biodiversity, because, and I used this analogy the other day, my concern is we're growing a bush. We have standard setters like ICMA and ISSB and TNFD over here with different KPIs. We have MDBs doing products with KPIs. We have academia. We have countries that are developing taxonomies, and they're all slightly different. And if we can align them, we can grow something tall and strong that allows us to rapidly go to the market and rapidly go to countries to achieve finance, instead of doing these bespoke indicators every single time. Now that's going to be hard, but I do think it's something that we can do as an MDB community. You know, at the IDB, we're also working with other MDB heads on this, and also working on bioeconomy. And there's an interesting group that we're co-chairing with the US Development Finance Corporation, looking at how do you bring different kinds of concessional credit enhancements to biodiversity finance. And so that's an emerging area where there's a lot of interesting discussion going on. And then last, I really couldn't be up here without talking a little bit about COP16, which is happening in Cali, as our colleague mentioned earlier. There's really a route between COP16 and COP30, which is going to happen in Belém, and how we merge the biodiversity and climate agendas to some extent. And that's what we've done at the IDB. We're all in one vertical. And so we're really seeing this in our region as an important continuation of the work. At the IDB, we're really looking at our regional approaches. We have an Amazon program, a Caribbean program, a Central America program, and also a way to highlight these countries that are doing really innovative finance and look at these policy mainstreaming issues as well. And so we're working on this agenda for COP16, aligned around these different kinds of areas, and we hope that you'll visit us in our pavilion and our partnerships with institutions like NatCap and other MDBs as well, where we learn and constantly share information. And I guess if I can end with one message, the message that there's two topics that I think are at the vanguard. We talked a little bit about subsidy reform and repurposing subsidies, and looking at who the subsidies are supposed to be benefiting, and can we still benefit those vulnerable populations while having nature positive outcomes. And then the other is this issue around MRV systems, monitoring and verification systems, and how we report them, because that's not, traditionally those are housed in ministries of environment. They're like to report to some nebulous UN convention out there that most people in the country don't know anything about or care about. What we've seen with climate is that when you can move those MRV systems into ministries of finance, because they're linked to financial products, they suddenly become much more important. And so with biodiversity, I think we want to see the same kind of thing, where ministries of finance are seeing these indicators as vital for attracting public and private investment into countries. And then that also leads to eventually needing some sort of registry, no matter what your financial product is, to see what the expected outcomes are, where they're going to be, and where they should go. And there's no silver bullet. I'll end with that. I think the criticism to this sector is like, well, this one product is not going to solve every problem in my country. And as what we say is, not every product is adequate for every need in every geographic location. Some are, some not. Let's sit down together and look at your priorities and see which ones work and how they can be combined, because some of these can be combined in interesting ways. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Greg. We'll come back with questions. So now we have two colleagues from the Asian Development Bank. So I think, are you going to go first, Ching Feng? Okay, and then Narayan.
So thank you so much, Mary. Again, IDB Lecture Capital Lab is an honor. Work together with other MDBs. Of course, our 15 DMCs and Stanford Lecture Capital project together for the last 2 years on the rapid lecture capital assessment. And the last 2 days, we get together to examine the progress of our lecture capital and also ecosystem assessment in these 15 countries. We also take lessons and also discuss about the way forward. So this morning, basically we agree we need to, after this global environmental facility project, we need to take this mechanism forward. One of the MDB together with our civil society, academies, create this platform for the scale-up lecture capital investment. This initiative comes from the 3 key observations. Number one is when we're talking about lecture capital accounting, we always compare with carbon accounting. Compared to the carbon accounting, lecture capital accounting always involves many small players, particularly with the farmers and the communities. And also, this farmers' communities' contribution relatively small and also very, very fragmented. It's difficult to aggregate their benefit. And at the same time, these farmers' communities, their capacity relatively weak and also difficult to collect the data. That is the difficulty we introduce lecture capital accounting method. So that is something we're also proud. Stanford University with the, of course, we also contribute lecture capital lab from the IDB. We work together, introduces the ecosystem product since 2014. And then after that, we also to collect the lessons for the biodiversity credit and many of the instruments. Now it's very important we develop the standardized and replicable approach for the lecture capital accounting. This is number one observation. Number two observation is when we're talking about internalize environmental externalities of the lecture capital investment, we always also compare the climate change intervention with lecture capital investment biodiversity conservations. In terms of the carbon emission reductions, always offer the global benefit, but for the lecture capital investment, always involve local benefit, regional benefit, and also the global benefit. In this case, it's very essential to introduce a practical equation formula to justify our incremental benefit and also argue for sharing costs with their key stakeholders. That's a key reason we need to introduce the regulatory framework, label the eco compensation or the payment for ecological services. Number three is about the shift the harmful subsidy to the nature positive activities, and at the same time also consolidate our financial resources with a focus on the ecological fragile area and also natural reserve areas, particularly for those areas, Amazon and also Southeast Asia countries and many other places. So with these observations, this morning, our MDBs agree to create this new platform for scale-up natural capital investment. The platform going to transform and scale up our innovations and also addresses the climate through natural access, and same time also ensuring inclusive economic and environmentally sustainable growth. So this platform going to take 4 key actions. Number 1 is developing standardized, replicable approaches for the natural capital accounting. Number 2 is strengthening the policy, institutional governance, and the regulatory framework and the tools. Number 3 is catalyze sustainable finance and also innovative financing mechanism. Finally, is introducing customized tools for the global application for a rapid natural capital approach. So again, while our MDB also agree to introduce a vehicle to test the result-based innovations and also share knowledge, and also they promote the knowledge sharing for the next few years. Again, ADB, we have the Natural Capital Lab. American Bank also a Natural Capital Lab. With Stanford University Natural Capital Project, we're going to take the agenda forward. So with this, I ask my colleague, Laria, quickly to share key innovations from the ADB Natural Capital Lab and also our Natural Capital teams for the new initiative. Laria, come.
Firstly, I would like to thank the Natural Capital Project team and Stanford for having us here and enabling this rich interaction. Before I explain a little more about ADB, to add to what Chin-Fen has already mentioned, I would like to thank Professor Shell. I'm still struggling with jet lag, and I was struggling to stay awake, and Professor Shell just shook me up. He showed a lot of correlations, positive correlations and negative correlations, but Professor, I can tell you one thing, the energy in your talk is negatively correlated to jet lag, for sure. The other thing I would like to thank you for, among many other things which I'm not mentioning, is the last thing you mentioned, which is connecting with nature. I think we are missing that, and I don't know, how many people appreciate that really, but I think you made a great point. So coming back to what I'm trying to explain, I think Greg already spoke elaborately about what MDBs really do, and truly IDB and Greg have been inspirations for us as well. So thank you. So I'm not going to repeat what MDBs generally look at nature for, but what I would like to talk specifically is the context of Asia and the Pacific and how we are approaching it perhaps in a slightly different way. So we are in a region which has, arguably the largest population in the world, the largest population of people below poverty line, and at the same time, the largest number of biodiversity hotspots. So, these are grim realities, and for whatever reason, we have not been able to collectively manage it very well over the years. And if you dig into it, there are logical reasons why. And Professor Shell, again, your presentation actually alluded to that, though in a different context. So how do we approach this is the fundamental question that we had. And the COVID, as well as the subsequent conflicts, which highlighted the food security issue, really gave us a perspective. And we soon realized that food systems, agri-food systems, and nature are so integrally linked to each other. And this has great relevance to Asia and the Pacific. and that we cannot achieve food security without addressing, this issue of natural capital erosion. So the climate, food, nature nexus, as even Qingfeng referred to in his talk, is the lens that we are looking at natural capital from. You could, of course, look at it from different lenses, but this is very, very important for Asia and the Pacific. Climate change, food security, natural capital loss, they all affect each other and are affected by the other, and hence are in a kind of a vicious cycle. And one effective way to break this is by investing more in nature. So how do we do that? I mean, partners like Stanford's Natural Capital Project are very, very key and integral in our strategy, in our multi-pronged strategy. They help us in, using the power of science, using methodologies of natural capital assessments and valuation, and help to demonstrate how important it is to protect grow nature for their own economic development. So our strategy has been to use this, develop capacity within our clients, develop capacity within our own staff as well, to help us address, the natural capital issues. How are we doing it? We have several tools, several initiatives. The Natural Capital Lab, as Qingfeng mentioned it, is a very important tool or a platform for us through which we are doing these assessments, through which we are valuing nature, through which we are trying to support innovative finance, designing eco-compensation mechanisms, and generating knowledge. I can see that I am running out of time, but I will transgress and take just an extra minute. Forgive me for that. And in addition to these, MDBs essentially are known for funding projects and for catalyzing, funding from other sources. So we have set up within ADB a dedicated team, natural capital and climate change team. Many of the members are here. Sean, who leads the team right now, is also there. So this team, is dedicated to developing projects that support both agri-food systems and natural capital growth. And they have, large pipelines through which we are trying to address this, but being supported by the knowledge, that our partners bring to us and the capacity that we develop within ourselves and with our DMCs. So in the interest of time, I'm stopping here, but with the message that for our region, food security and natural capital go hand in hand, and that's what we are trying to address primarily through science-based methods, through our tools like Natural Capital Lab, and through dedicated groups that we have, the Natural Capital and Climate Group, for focusing on funding requirements of our clients. I'll stop here. There are a lot of us who are present here who are ready to answer any questions that you may have. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Narayan and Qingfeng. We'll have plenty of time for discussion and questions because there's such a rich set of examples from all of these. And as you can tell, we all get a lot of joy out of working together. This is just a wonderful group who've become friends over this course of this work, and that's what keeps everything moving. So I'd like to invite now Bekele, our colleague from the World Bank, to share what innovations are going on there.
Thank you. Just for a change, I'm going to come down from the floor, so I'll be talking from the floor. Thanks very much, everyone, and especially the NatCap team for inviting the World Bank and colleagues to participate in this forum. It's a great pleasure, and I would like to kind of bring in this quick conversation one or two issues which don't seem to have been reflected sufficiently, I think, in this forum. That is sort of the policy angle. In the World Bank, much of what we do around the natural capital is very much at the end of the day, it's about policy. It's about policies currently actually blindsiding nature and biodiversity and ecosystem services, which are critical. So in terms of making nature visible and considered as critical in decision making, it needs to be mainstreamed into policy processes, decision making, planning, budgeting, and investments. So that's what the World Bank's program is trying to do. Of course, I don't have to tell you this, but nature is, of course, our most critical asset in terms of really not just development, but also for fighting climate change. I think climate change angle is not also emphasized much. We have heard quite a bit about COP15 and 16, but the climate angle is critically important. And of course, nature is not just important for development, it's also fundamental for human life itself, as we have also heard many times. So, and of course, nature's threats or loss of nature is more immediate, its impacts more immediate, more local, and it tends to be very severe as well for a lot of communities at the World Bank, and many of MDB colleagues are working in as well. So at the end of the day, from our side, from the Global Program on Sustainability, our interest is in terms of really mainstreaming nature into decision-making processes so that some of the things which are outside of the market, which are not priced properly, are actually brought into the decision-making process, and that we address the challenge from its root causes, not just from the symptoms. So the World Bank has been actually working in this space for quite a long time, about 10 years or more. We started with what we call WAVES, Wealth Accounting and Evaluation of Ecosystem Services, which started around 2012. And it has run its course, and we have been trying to mainstream natural capital accounting, valuation of ecosystem services, and strengthening data and analysis in different countries through WAVES. That took over, that was followed by what we call WAVES Plus, which has run for some time, and then now we are under Global Program on Sustainability, which I lead since 2020. And under the Global Program for Sustainability, we are working at different levels. The first is sort of a global level, because the key challenge for markets actually for blindsiding nature is lack of information and evidence. Markets fail because there is no data and pricing nature, and in terms of that, we are working at the global level in terms of really generating information to inform decision making, and also dialogues like this kind of dialogue at a global level. So we have a program working on the global issues. We have also country programs where we actually work with several countries. We provide technical assistance and grants to countries to be able to generate data and mainstream this information into decision-making processes, working with statistical departments, plus ministries of planning and economy, treasury, central banks, and so forth. And then we also, one element which doesn't seem to have been emphasized in this forum so far is also the private sector angle. We do a lot of work on greening the financial systems. There is a lot of resources out there in the private sector that could be actually put into greening the system, and we have a very important area of work, including on making sure that the private sector takes into account risks associated with nature and biodiversity loss in ecosystem services, and we have the third angle which is working on this. One of the key areas where I think the World Bank and the GPS and WAVES have been contributing is in terms of really measuring the values of nature. And we call this Changing Wealth of Nations. We are producing the 5th edition of this report, and it's one of the sort of highly downloaded documents from the World Bank. Some of you might be aware. And the World Bank's work, especially in this area, is very exciting. We have been contributing a lot in terms of really broadening the scope of the work, broadening the types of assets to be which are included in the wealth measurement itself, and expanding the asset boundaries, and one of the key gaps there, of course, is sort of the prof when he was talking about in the keynote speech earlier, there is quite a limited substitutability between natural capital and produced capital. In urban areas, we have a lot of produced capital, so many high-rise, buildings and so forth, a lot of, material which has been produced, economic assets, but that doesn't necessarily replace natural capital. So that's one of the things that we would like to work with universities like Stanford, actually, in terms of really measuring this substitution between natural capital and other types of assets, especially produced assets, which is very important because there should be more complementarity than substitution. And that's one of the key challenges that we are facing in that area. One of the exciting things we are doing at the bank is also in terms of actually facilitating our dialogue with countries is mainstreaming nature into our modeling work at a macro level. So the World Bank, as you know, when we work with countries, we have macroeconomic models, and usually, so far, climate has been integrated into those decision support tools, but nature is relatively new. So we are now bringing in ecosystem services into these kinds of models, and we have started piloting this exercise in a few countries, and hopefully in the coming few years, this area of work would be much more advanced so that we have the tools actually in terms of facilitating our discussion and dialogue with the Ministry of Finance and others. At a country level, we work in several countries around the world. We have activities that we call core implementing countries. There are here about 8 or 9 listed there, and several others that we are working with with the core implementing countries, we give a grant of about $1 million each for implementing much more robust, more rigorous type of support in terms of generating data that informs activities and policies at the country level. And this is also coupled with a lot of work that we do through lending. The effect of whatever grant we give actually is multiplied manifold through our investments, the lending investments that the World Bank provides to countries. So the impact is multiplied manifold as a result of our leveraging ability through the core implementing country support. We also provide a lot of technical assistance to different countries at a smaller level in terms of addressing key challenges in terms of creating data and evidence on the values of nature and making, of course, nature's values much more transparent. And let me mention quickly, we also have an annual forum that we call Natural Capital Forum. We had our last forum in Africa, in Rwanda. It was basically focusing more on how we use data and evidence for informing the global biodiversity framework. So we will have our next forum, 2025 as well, hopefully in Washington, D.C. You will be all invited to participate in that if you can. We have also another forum for Africa only, because Africa is, of course, one of the regions where we have a lot of challenges in terms of really in building capacity. So we have a regional forum. Colleague here from the leading a program will be presenting and speaking about that program as well in the coming days. Just to give you very quickly examples of the kinds of work which we have been doing, different types of natural capital accounts which have been produced. We have about 47 different types of natural capital accounts, including actually the ecosystem accounts, which are very important. These are part of the ecosystem accounts, which are not part of SIA framework. Some of you who know that. The experimental ecosystem accounts are relatively new, and I'm happy to see here that we have actually done quite a few, and we have quite a few that are coming up as well going forward. We are lagging a little bit behind in terms of ocean or ecosystem, ocean-related ecosystem accounting in that space overall. But this map kind of shows you sort of where we are. We are working in about 30 countries. We'd like to kind of hold hands and synergize with other development banks as well as others who are working in many of these countries. We are also trying to expand a little bit more into Central American countries, in Africa, and also in Asia Pacific and South Asia, Central Asia, and so forth. So we'll be happy to collaborate with you in many of these countries we work in. I think we use this evidence and data for informing many of the policy challenges that many countries face. So I won't be spending much time on that. So as I mentioned earlier, the last bit here is about generating data and evidence to inform the financial sector. We have what we call the environmental and social governance database, which is publicly available, and is being used by the private sector, the financial system in terms of informing a lot of decisions, a lot of analytical work that is available also on our website. You are happy to have a look at that. And I think this is almost my final slide. One of the key things, and I think one of the things that I liked about this forum was the 3 Ps, the people, putting people on the front. And I think we are trying to kind of really understand the nexus between natural resource degradation and loss of ecosystem services and the welfare and well-being of the people, especially for communities that depend so much on this natural capital. So this is sort of a new area. We are trying to produce a flagship report also on this nexus, looking at case studies around the world. So thank you very much for the opportunity. I'm happy to take some questions later. Thank you.
Thank you, Bekele. You can see there's a lot of synergies here among these financial institutions. So the last speaker is Adam Wang-Levine, who is Deputy Assistant Secretary for Climate, Environment, and Infrastructure with U.S. Treasury. And it's fascinating to hear the role that U.S. Treasury is playing, and we're really interested to hear your reflections, Adam. So welcome.
First off, I wanted to thank the Natural Capital Project team and Mary for hosting us for this important conversation. And as Mary just mentioned, I'm our Deputy Assistant Secretary for Climate and Environment and Infrastructure, and much of the work that we're doing at the U.S. Treasury has multiple areas of overlap. I'll highlight a couple of them. I think first, in terms of what the U.S. Treasury does, we are shareholders in many of the multilateral development banks, and so work very closely with the MDBs, in which we're shareholders, on how we can prioritize these issues. A second important area for this is a couple of times the multilateral climate and environment funds also came up. And so my team also oversees the work of the GEF and the GCF and others that are active in this space. And finally, I should mention, we also represent the United States at multilateral fora like the G20 and the G7. And so I actually co-chaired the G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group, which for the first time is actually focused on nature and biodiversity as one of its core priorities. And we'll touch on some of that work in my remarks. I'll also say I'm an alum of Stanford, and it's incredibly nice to be back. So I'm especially grateful for having the opportunity to be back at Stanford. So I wanted to make 3 points in terms of the work that U.S. Treasury is doing in this space. First is, this was touched on by some of the MDBs, how we think about the value of nature and biodiversity. Second, the role that we see for the MDBs in this work. And third, how we think about private finance and much of the scientific work that is happening through the Natural Capital Project and others that are doing research in this space. First, in terms of how we think about value, I think it's clear and was mentioned by multiple MDBs that there's an immense value to nature and biodiversity to people, both in terms of how the global loss of biodiversity can present significant economic challenges, but also the interactions between nature and biodiversity and development priorities like public health, food security, and obviously climate change. But oftentimes, we don't understand the value of this, particularly at ministries of finance. And so we're trying to do a lot of work and work with partners in terms of coming up to speed on how we can quantify the value of some of these issues. I think in this sense, natural capital assessments and accounting are incredibly valuable tools to mobilize finance and policies to support these issues. Domestically, this was touched on, I believe, by our keynote speaker in terms of some of the work that we're doing with the national strategy to develop statistics for environmental and economic decisions. So we launched this last year in terms of some of the efforts that we're taking domestically. And just in April, we announced the development of a few pilot accounts focused on land, water, and environmental activities. And so we're really excited about where some of this work can go. I want to turn to the second issue in terms of the role of the international financial institutions and the MDBs. I think they have an incredibly important role to play on these issues. But it's not just where nature is the entry point. We think across all sectors, in terms of the work that the MDBs are doing, nature and biodiversity can be an area of focus. And I'll highlight a couple of areas of priorities that we see for the MDBs on this issue. First is, can we allow for ways in which the MDBs can almost pilot structures for private capital to come into this space? We think that in many ways they can pilot business models that private capital can then follow in line with, as well as pioneer blended finance structures, which we think can really help bring in private capital into these markets, which are needed. A second area, this was touched on by many of the MDBs, as well as Mary, in terms of supporting capacity and policy development. We think this is incredibly important work and can allow for countries to develop enabling environments that catalyze investments in nature and biodiversity, as well as work towards policy coherence, which isn't always discussed, but we think is incredibly important, and the MDBs can play a very important role in this space. A final area that I would like to touch on is we think there's incredible synergies between the multilateral climate funds and environment funds, as well as the MDBs. I think this is shown in some of the work that the GEF and the Natural Capital Project and the MDBs are undertaking, and we think this can be an early start and model for some of the ways in which these institutions can collaborate. Finally, I'll turn to the role of private finance in this space. I think it can't be underscored the importance of how we can bring in private financial institutions into making these investments. And as I mentioned, the Sustainable Finance Working Group for the first time is talking about nature and biodiversity. And what we're focused on more specifically is how can we provide financing instruments for nature-based solutions? And are there ways in which finance ministries and central banks can help articulate principles that can really help countries develop a lot of these approaches? However, we've noticed that there are many challenges for private capital to enter into these markets. I think projects are often small and fragmented. Project design can be complex. And as I mentioned earlier, we need to quantify the value of a lot of these projects. And so in the face of these challenges, we think a lot of the work that's being done by the Natural Capital Project and others in this space, as well as the MDBs, can be incredibly valuable in terms of how we can overcome some of these challenges. And I would also say to many of the academics and researchers here, your work is critical to our success here, and we're really hoping to leverage a lot of this research so that we can articulate a more coherent and effective case for how we can make some of these policies and decisions. I'll finally end with, many of us have been talking about the COPs that are upcoming, and I think we're pretty excited about how we now have 2 tropical forest countries, both with Colombia as well as Brazil next year, with the Climate COP hosting some of these very important discussions, and how we can also talk about the interactions between climate and nature, which I think sometimes aren't emphasized enough. I'd also underscore that the United States is going to be hosting some of these discussions as well, with the G20 discussions in 2026 and G7 discussions in 2027. And so we're thinking about how can we take forward some of these issues and these discussions when the United States is hosting these fora. Finally, I would just say I'm around for the next few days, and we're really excited to learn more about some of the work that's being done here, and would be really encouraged to have conversations with you about how we can be better leveraging and supporting some of this work. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Adam. It's really interesting to hear your perspective because you see across all the MDBs and these other big IFIs, as you mentioned. So that's really interesting to hear. So last but not least, we have Dr. Adrian Vogl from the Natural Capital Project, who will talk about some of our vision for scaling and sustaining some of this.
Well, thank you all so much for coming from, some of you from very far away, to experience this incredible gathering of experts, of researchers, of professionals in this field. And I count myself just so lucky to be to be one of this group and to be allowed to interact with everyone, and really looking forward to the next few days together. And I also find it incredibly inspiring, and exciting the level of commitments that we've seen from the MDB partners we have here, as well as the U.S. Treasury. And I think it's clear that we have this incredible alignment now behind nature as an engine of prosperity, as an engine of sustainable prosperity. And in fact, we have the Inter-American Development Bank, the World Bank, and the Asian Development Bank here, but I believe there are actually 8 signatory MDBs on the joint statement for 10 signatories on that joint statement of MDBs for nature, people, and planet. And so, for all of us who have been, working in this space for a long time, some more than a decade, it's really super exciting to see this momentum building. So, and I, personally, just seeing the change, this huge change that we've experienced, that we've witnessed in the way decision makers in governments, in corporations, and in international financial institutions, in MDBs, the way they're thinking about nature, and as I said, an engine of prosperity, as not a separate thing that we have to worry about in addition to how do we feed everybody and how do we build enough roads and how do we get enough energy. It's actually the fundamental thing that underpins the prosperity of the planet. And the evidence that this viewpoint, that this perspective is changing is really all around us. I mean, it's everyone in this room. We have people from more than 50 countries representing over 200 different organizations and a variety of different sectors that go well beyond environment into finance and consulting and private sector, et cetera. So we see that this concept of natural capital as a key strategy in human development and the fight against climate change has taken off. And so demand for these kinds of approaches is really soaring. And in fact, although we still have this $800 billion gap, just to give one example for biodiversity financing, or the more optimistic $300 billion estimate if we think about policy coherence, we still have this funding gap. But the reality is, in the last decade, the financing for nature has also taken off. I mean, there are billions of dollars already committed to the financing of nature and natural capital approaches. And so what we're seeing, though, is still, we're seeing the momentum in demand, we're seeing the momentum rising, but what is holding us back now? Why are we, how do we go from working with 15 countries like we're doing now in Natural Capital Project, or the 50 countries we have here, how do we go to 100 countries or every country in the world? And so I believe that there's actually some key gaps that still limit the accelerated momentum that we really urgently need. And although we do see this incredible increase in financial commitment to nature, the funding is actually outstripping the availability of expertise and experts and people who know what to do with it and know how to actually implement this. And that's why I think gatherings like this are super important. And so in response to this, actually I just wanted to talk a little bit more in a little bit more detail about what some of these specific gaps are that I think that this community is well positioned to try and address. First of all, there's the gap between the concept of nature and natural capital and its application, its practical application in climate and nature, climate, finance, and policies. As Mary was showing in her slide earlier, you have a decision maker in a country, perhaps someone from a Department of Forests or Department of Environment who says, I want to include nature-based solutions in my country's climate adaptation plan. But what do I do? How do I get there? And so they're faced with questions of, what expertise and resources are needed to do that? How do I actually integrate nature into the sectoral plans that are often the foundation of these climate adaptation policies? And what are the financing options out there? And secondly, I think that I argue that gaps in capacity, between capacity and the practical application, is another major gap that needs to be filled. So this same decision maker is also faced with, what data do I need? What tools are available? how can I set realistic targets and demonstrate co-benefits? How do I value these nature's benefits to people and to the economy in a way that's compelling? And ultimately, how do I find qualified experts who can help? And I think it's very true that there are pockets of innovation all around the world. And so this capacity is starting to blossom around the world. However, these pockets of knowledge and expertise are often scattered, and everyone's kind of innovating in their different silos. And so what we're visioning now at Natural Capital Project, along with partners, is a technical assistance center, which you have heard Sir Chengfeng refer to earlier. And this technical assistance center would act as a knowledge hub that would help to fill some of these critical gaps. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what this might look like and who would be involved, but first, just what are the kind of activities that we envision that this technical assistance center, this knowledge hub, could provide. First of all, knowledge brokering is super important. Just understanding what innovations are out there, where the expertise is, and helping people to helping decision makers, particularly to scope and provide insight on what expertise is needed, what resources might be needed, what time, and just to help sort of develop an action plan for how do you move forward on, for example, including nature-based solutions in your climate adaptation plan. Identifying research, application, or capacity building needs, and then matchmaking with people who can help fill those needs. Also, we envision that there's always a role for the kind of hands-on technical support where experts who have experience in these approaches can co-develop innovative approaches and also just help build a body of scientific knowledge and tools, publishing through peer-reviewed and high-impact science, et cetera, and just really kind of getting in the weeds on the ground with these people in countries who want to design the policies, who need to do the valuation analyses and go through all the steps to go from the concept to the practical application. Capacity development would also be another really important component of this because, as we know, there are these pockets of innovation throughout the world. We need to not only have a mechanism to allow decision makers and professionals to access the expertise that's out there, but also to really fire up this pipeline of creating new professionals coming into the space, training them up on how to do this. Because if we really want this momentum to explode, we need people who are ready to meet this demand. And then finally, building on the Invest suite of tools that NatCap's been working on, as well as tools available from other, many other innovators in this space, having a clearinghouse of freely available tools that people can use along with access to the technical skills. You also need, tools, models, et cetera, to do the kind of valuation that supports all of this work. And then I'll just end here with, what does this look like in terms of, who's involved? So at the center of this idea is this knowledge hub or this technical assistance center. And it's going to require, first of all, research institutes. For example, Stanford University, the Natural Capital Project, and its research partners that can provide the cutting edge science, can innovate on new approaches, and can provide support to capacity development through offering workshops and courses, et cetera, to clients who might come for assistance from this technical center. Data providers will also be really important to help provide data and derived products on the status of nature, the values of nature. There's a ton of innovation in that space, so the idea is to tap into some of that as well. We'd also be relying, of course, on MDBs and development partners, and particularly excited to hear the idea put forward of this platform to scale investment in nature. So this kind of a platform could be a really welcome partner in the kind of venture we're talking about here. We're envisioning around this assistance center. And then finally, expert consultants. I think are going to be really important for doing the kind of technical assistance, the kind of helping to do the work and holding the hand of people and helping give hands-on training experiences to people throughout the world. And we have already some consultants that we know are very knowledgeable in this space. So, for example, the Natural Capital Insights group Actually, there's many innovators in this space that we can draw on. But in addition, the idea is to begin to build the army of consultants working in all the countries in the world who are the ones actually supporting governments in doing policy analysis, doing valuation, doing project cost-benefit analysis, et cetera. So this is a super important component. This is a vision that we are actively building and fundraising for. And if you're interested in learning more, I'd be very happy to talk with you if you're interested in being part of it. Also, very happy to talk with you about that. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Adrian. Okay, so what I'm going to do is just ask each panel member to answer one question very briefly, because what we'd really like to do is engage with you all. There's so much richness of topics here that I'm sure you have questions. And I have two main types of questions. One is, I'll start with you, Greg, and one is around something that came up a lot the last 2 days, which is how is IDB, and other multilaterals can answer this question as well, how is your natural capital finance including distributional and equity considerations in the countries that are the loan recipients and grants, et cetera? Because it's obviously a very important topic for all the countries, and I know also for IDB, so.
Sure, thanks, Mary. So I think one is just even the language and the posture that we take at the beginning of a project, right? I think we try to avoid the language of, well, the local community, the indigenous population, Afro-descendants are beneficiaries of the project, because they're not beneficiaries of the project. They should be co-creators and owners of the project. And so, and that's evidenced in a few different projects that we've worked on. We have an Amazon initiative which is focused on basically sustainable development in the Amazon, with a very important focus on indigenous communities. Within that, we've looked at, for example, some biodiversity credit projects, but those biodiversity credits are actually being conceptualized, organized, and commercialized by indigenous communities. And in Colombia, for example, and actually doing these kinds of tokens that can pay for environmental results, where the actual owner of that is the local community. Similarly, we're looking with some funding we have from Canada at the Nature-Based Solutions program I mentioned, where one of the projects that we're doing in Colombia is looking at important cities with Afro-descendant populations where we know that they are the managers and the decision makers on the natural resources, and they're a really important resilience component to the activities that could be taking place if we get the policy framework right and the financing framework right. And so we're really focusing on them as agents of change within their communities from the very beginning. It's not that we're working with somebody that says, we really need to do more nature-based solutions and let's do it, and then at the end of the chain you find who the actors are. It's actually starting with the actors from the beginning. So I think that shift is really important for us in this kind of work.
Yeah, great, thank you. So I have another type of question, and then I'd love to ask ADB and World Bank, Bekele, to choose which one of these would you like to elaborate on. Similar question to the one that Greg has just addressed, and the other one is, you talked about so many really exciting and financially, impressive magnitude efforts investing in nature and nature-positive development. Which ones do you feel have the greatest opportunity right now to be implemented? So that's one question you can take, or you can take the one that Greg just addressed. Those are two that came up a lot this morning and yesterday, and I just wanted to hear a little bit more reflection from you. So.
Yeah, probably I started with a landscape approach, and then after that, probably Nadia can also quickly share. Recently, we have Natural Capital Fund just established how to scale up. Again, when we come to natural capital investment, we need to recognize we are facing with the small players, the farmers, communities, and so on and so forth. In the past, we engage the farmers community through the eco compensation or payment for ecological services. But through the voluntary arrangement, quite hard to scale up. So the way we are doing for Yangtze River Economic Initiative, the framework approach is basically to introduce the mechanism link the farmers, communities, counties from the upstream to the downstream. And then when we selected the project, one of the key criteria we ask each of the province to consider is they need to have eco compensation scheme to act in the upstream downstream relations. So again, this framework approach being introduced in 2017. Now is we already deliver 3.7 billion US dollars investment. And now we started with the Hill River Ecological Corridor project. Now is because of the Himalaya Kushi initiative, the glacier retreat going to impact the downstream, the 12 river basins. So again, this approach going to be replicated to the other river basins as well. So probably Laria can quickly share this Natural Capital Fund we just established, and then how this can be quickly replicated to the next stage.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chikwen. So the National Capital Fund is a new initiative of ADB. It's a concessional and catalytic fund, still in the making, and targeted at benefiting ultimately smallholder farmers and SMEs, and typically reaching out to projects that have a very strong natural capital component in them, but also, in the food systems, agri-food systems sectors. And as I mentioned earlier, our intention is to try and transform agri-food systems. And to do that, we believe we need to invest in natural capital-oriented projects. So yes, that's what we intend to do.
Thank you, yeah. And Bekele, yeah, you get to choose too.
Yeah, let me just speak about the inclusion one, actually, the one on equity, because I think that's something that we don't talk about enough. So in this, the kind of work we do at the bank, impact is usually a function of first country ownership. The country has to believe in the kind of implementation and program, both technical, scientific solutions, nature-based solutions that we bring in, and also the kind of policy we promote. There has to be ownership at sort of a national level, but also at the local level, the community level. And when we work at the community level, usually one of the big challenges we face is how do we make sure that the interventions we support actually enhance equity and inclusion, particularly for women. And several of the donors which support our program ask this question. Of course, the restoration of natural capital, which has been degraded over many years itself, is a big challenge. But when degradation itself, of course, affects livelihoods and the well-being of the people. But when it improves, who benefits from it is critically important. So we try to promote inclusion and participation, equity through benefit sharing mechanisms to make sure that no one is left behind, or that they are completely negatively affected from our interventions. So it could be a carbon related income, for example, from carbon sequestration in landscapes. So when a community actually earns some income like that, it's important that we actually foster inclusion and benefit sharing to make sure that the community owns up to understands the benefits of improving natural capital, and that this also kind of reflects upwards as well into mainstream at a national level into policies and programs. So inclusion is a very important angle of the people's perspective we take at the World Bank, because as you probably all know, the World Bank's new vision is to end poverty on a livable planet. So you can't end, poverty, of course, if your natural resources being depleted completely, and you are leaving significant section of the community behind. So inclusion, especially on the gender angle, is a very important aspect of the work we do on natural capital.
Thank you. Okay, great to hear. Okay, Adam, I'll turn to you. So you mentioned both the biodiversity COP in Colombia this fall and next year's climate COP coming up in Brazil. Can you say a little bit more about why that connection between nature and biodiversity through those two COPs is so important?
Sure. And I think, as many of you know, there's very important interactions between these two. And what we've observed is, as we see climate change, as well as the historical loss of nature and biodiversity, we think they oftentimes feed into each other. And in order to address them, you need to think about the approach more holistically. But oftentimes what we've seen from many policymakers is there's a natural bias towards thinking about these issues in silos. I have policies that address mitigation. I have policies that address biodiversity loss, but you don't really take this more holistic, comprehensive approach. And I think one of the benefits of some of the work that you're doing with the Natural Capital Project and many of you are doing with your research is how can we articulate and quantify some of the interactions between these concepts? Can we more definitively talk about how the loss of biodiversity or ecosystems impacts climate change? And we think that when these connections can be made, you're just going to lead to better outcomes and policies. And so bringing it back to the COPs, I think by having, as I mentioned, 2 tropical forest nations hosting these COPs in such close proximity to each other, we think that there's a really opportune moment to talk about the importance of these connections.
Yeah, okay, great. Yeah, that's exciting. Okay, thank you. And one more question for Adrian, which will then help us segue to the rest of you. So Adrian, out of this climate nature nexus and the vision you laid out for the Technical Assistance Center or Knowledge Hub, what is your request of this community? This is obviously going to take a village, a big village, as you said. So what is your specific request of this community for how they might think about engaging?
Well, that's a very good question. Thank you for that. I think that one thing that we're still wrapping our minds around, and in the last couple of days discussions with our project teams has started to crystallize this, but is what is it where are the bottlenecks that people are really struggling with? I mean, obviously the vision that we've laid out here is huge and could be very comprehensive, but in order to be strategic and sort of address the problems in the order of importance, what are the bottlenecks that people are still struggling with in terms of the kind of expertise needed, the kinds of analyses needed? Is it data? Is it analysis? Is it knowledge of innovative financing mechanisms? Is it access to funders? Is it access to finance? Just helping to envision, what is the most important next strategic direction for such an alliance? And then I think the second thing I would ask of this group is just to help us envision, what the different institutions, if you see a role for yourself in this, what kind of different roles institutions can have, and how can we link this to a sustainable financing model to sustain this kind of support for the transformation that we're all working towards.
Okay, great. So I'd love to hear any questions or comments from the audience in that next 5 or so minutes, and then we'll close, and we have a wonderful poster session and reception waiting for us outside. So I see a question over here, and then one over here. Okay, great.
Hi, thanks so much. Lucas Black from World Wildlife Fund. I think it's fantastic the trend lines are so positive for the MDBs on this topic. I think what I would ask, and maybe, is that when you look at, I think, the top 14 MDBs, I think it's about $800 billion of development assets, or up to maybe say $1 trillion. But even in the case of IDB, the investments, and I think you've been a leader in this space, have been relatively modest over the last 5 years in terms of kind of building this up. So I think the question I have to you is, I think the trend line is positive, but I think a lot of us practitioners are saying, it's just not happening fast enough. It's from such a low baseline. and it's just not happening fast enough, even for the leaders. So I think the question is, if you'd be candid, if I could each ask all of you to be candid, really, what is it going to take to make this accelerate in a way where we're really seeing this go from niche to mainstream? I mean, that's what we want, those of us that have worked on this for years. So how are we going to take this from, a lab, a group of people at an MDB that is working on this, to really be front and center in terms of your mandates and your lending? Thank you so much.
Can I? I'll take a first stab, right? Because you mentioned IDB. I think part of what you say, actually, you see in our journey, right? Because we really, in earnest, we've been working on this since, 2010 at least, but I think since 2018 is when we really started to make a concerted effort in this, kind of trajectory. And now, just, a couple months ago, now it's actually in our institutional strategy, it's in our, new impact framework. And so I think that's when you start to really see the shift, right? Because it goes from being something that there's a group of people that they're pushing it, they're working with the sectors, but once it gets into the institutional mandate, which is approved by our governors, is where you actually start to mainstream it across all of the sectors. And it's not that we're doing one project here, but we're incorporating nature into the vast majority of projects and taking slices of all of them. And so that's been at least my experience. The other thing that I would also mention again is that it's only last year that as MDBs we came forward with common principles on how to track nature finance and nature positive finance. And so I think, and some of us track green finance and then it has subcomponents of biodiversity, but I'm not convinced that we actually were tracking everything that we actually were doing. So I still think the baseline is low, but I actually think it's maybe a little higher than it looked like it was. And I think as we start to pilot this tracking methodology, you're going to see, kind of a better baseline or a better indicator of where things are. And I think that these new kinds of using our policy-based guarantees and our policy-based loans is really important, because I wouldn't only focus on the dollar amount. There's a huge value to incorporating policy changes in the matrix of a project that may be only tangentially dollar related to biodiversity, but that completely transform the way a country is dealing with one of these sectors. And so I don't like to focus only on the dollars. I like to also focus on the policy shift.
Okay, so quickly, Narayan, and then I want to get 2 more questions, and then we're going to call it. Okay, Narayan.
Yeah, so thanks for raising that. It reminded me of that slide with the elephant some time back. So it is indeed a challenge, and this challenge, I think, is on our minds constantly. I can only think of a couple of things. One is an analogy to, let's say, the renewable energy sector, how it increased. There were incentives that were provided, tax breaks, but also costs went down. Now, in the case of nature-oriented projects, I don't know how costs will go down, but we need to have a lot more thought on how we can make it easier. So incentivization is one. And how to make things easier for these investments to happen. It could be a combination of things. And capacity building is an important thing that we're doing. It's not an easy solution. The second thing is also where I'm optimistic is initiatives like the task force on financial nature-related financial disclosures. Eventually, I believe that making these kind of things mandatory, I'm again looking at it analogously to the need for presenting audited accounts, that came in the private sector many, many years ago. And today it's achieved a level of compliance, people take it for granted. And if you don't audit your accounts, then you have an issue. Similarly, we need to progress towards making disclosures on nature-related activities mandatory, so that if you don't do that, then there is a consequence. And that will lead to, over a period of time, much more investments, and it could snowball into an exponential increase. But again, it's a good question. No easy answers.
Thank you. Okay, I want to get these last 2 questions, and then I'm going to hold the answers. I'll get them both out on the table, and then we'll let those of you who haven't responded have the last word. Okay, please.
Hi, I'm Teresa Kong. I'm a student of Natural Capital. I was wondering if maybe Adrian and Mary, if you could maybe speak to how you might debottleneck this capacity based on what's capable today. And what I mean by that is, if I imagine this world where you can marry a weather app with a ChatGPT, with all of the geospatial data that's going to be available as all of these new satellites are going to be launched, we're going to have the capability over the next 5 years that we've never seen before. And to your point about impact and broadening the reach, if we don't need to develop this army of technical consultants, but make it so available and so dummy-proof that anyone can just prompt this to grab the right layer of geospatial data. And I can't imagine a better place to do this than Stanford, where you've got the interdisciplinary approach across AI, across computer science, as well as involving, for example, the Chinese Academy of Sciences, which really understand how to do imaging, right? In addition to large learning models. So I would love to hear what's being done from that perspective if you were to actually whiteboard a new invest.
Okay, thank you. Great question. And then one more over here just to get it out, and then we'll respond. Can you hand him the mic? Thank you. Okay,
Hi,
this is the last.
I'm Nicholas Ron from the Ministry of Economy in Chile. My question is for Adam. We see, and especially in developing countries, that the sort of effort that entails doing this sort of transformation means a yearly commitment on spending and on developing the capabilities in the different nations, right? And so for me, there's some major gap in terms of the macroeconomic aspect of how this can be part of the budgetary allocations throughout the years. I feel like we should aim for some sort of equivalent to a fiscal rule when it comes to this sort of spending. But for me, it's tough to see how we could achieve that. Do you think there's some sort of innovation in terms of macroeconomic management that could help us align long-term spending, understanding that many of the goals that we're looking for are probably 5, 6, 10 years away, and of course a budgetary discussion happens every single year?
Go ahead, Adam. You can take that. Yeah.
I mean, I think it's a great question. And I think part of the reason that I think this is the first time the US Treasury has come to this symposium is to think about how we can integrate a lot of the scientific work, potentially to make some of those policy innovations. Drawing it back to some of the domestic work that I mentioned that we're doing within the US government, we are trying to think about how we can mainstream and bring in some of the natural capital accounting principles into our budgetary process. And so while that's being done by the OSTP, we are thinking about ways in which we can have the Office of Science Technology Policy. We are thinking about ways in which we can bring that in to different parts of the US government and mainstream it in. But I think it's a really good question, and I think maybe we can partner on thinking about different approaches here over the coming days.
If I may quickly supplement, is the lessons learned from the eco-compensation scheme the Yangtze River is learned from the disaster, the big floods take place there. So this is incorporate, we call it a Green for Green program, is incorporate this scheme in the budget system. So that is a proof quite effective. Of course, you need to introduce metrics, measure the progress.
Thank you. Okay, Bekele, and then we have to call it.
Very quickly, I think just on both questions related to urgency and also the artificial intelligence issue, I think overall in the MDBs, especially in the World Bank, we are trying to fast track. Of course, we are not fast enough in terms of addressing, the challenges of nature loss, biodiversity, et cetera, which I said earlier are severe, local, extreme, and they are most urgent for the communities we work with. But at the same time, there is a lot of effort and interest to fast track the process. And of course, artificial intelligence is going to make things a little bit better. Fortunately, for example, for natural capital accounting, as long as data remains in the public domain, I think ecosystem accounts, natural capital accounts, even for low-income countries that don't have data now, are likely to be available in the near term thanks to artificial intelligence, remote sensing, and all of that. that could facilitate things better. Of course, nature is a little bit delayed compared to the climate community, but I think the links are important. And there's a lot of catching up as well in the World Bank. For example, as I mentioned earlier, on the policy side, we are mainstreaming as well nature-related data, ecosystem service-related data into decision-making platforms, including macroeconomic modeling tools, which will facilitate our dialogues with the countries and policymakers a bit better. Thanks.
Okay, great. Thank you. Adrian, would you like the last word on her question?
Yeah, thank you. Just to add on to what Bekele was saying, I think that absolutely advances in data availability and artificial intelligence will help overcome many of the technical gaps. In fact, some of our colleagues here from WWF are at the forefront of generating novel approaches to understand the globally making the data available on what is the status of natural capital and ecosystem services. However, I think it's interesting that you brought up ChatGPT as an example, because I think that really the expertise that is going to be needed is not going to be the technical expertise to crunch data. It is going to be the expertise to sit at a negotiating table and understand how to drive a change in policy and governance, which is ultimately a process of human interaction, which we don't yet have the AI capability to substitute.
Yeah, great. Okay, good point to end on. Thank you very much, everybody, for a really stimulating discussion.